I've been a lawyer for 45 years in Alabama, and this is going to be my opening statement in support of my new ebook, Truth About the Old South, A Case for African American Exceptionalism. My book is a lengthy, accurate, factual American history ebook with social commentary, written from a conservative perspective that's almost never encountered in Old South and slavery scholarship. Now, some of the 100 people who received free ebooks at random on account of our promotion took an immediate dislike to the book and gave me 1-star, 1-line ratings. But I want to promise you, contrary to one of them, this book is a lot more than Republican BS. Truth About the Old South, A Case for African American Exceptionalism, is pro-American. Being an American is 100 times more important than race. A lot of people don't like the way this sounds, but the United States was the best place in the world to be a slave. And I prove it. And then it became the best place in the world to be a freed person and then a full citizen. Less than 400,000 slaves were brought to what's now the United States of America. And now there are 45 million African Americans. Over 100 African Americans for every one slave brought across the Atlantic. That's not genocide. It's the opposite of genocide. We support the inclusive rule of law and Black central position in establishing the inclusiveness of our rule of law here in the United States by making the Constitution more inclusive. And I took that from the 1619 Project. I otherwise criticized them. Now, a good number of the slavery scholars were Marxists, communists, and they put their stamp on this whole subject in academia. And the subject, to a large extent, still carries the abolitionist dogma that slavery was horrible in every way, and some folks even say is the worst slave system anywhere ever. It's not true. It's not true. A top field hand in today's money was worth at least $50,000, and that pretty much guaranteed good treatment. And you know, people love their money, and the slaves were the money of the planters, and the slaves knew that. They knew they were valued. This book is simultaneously pro-Christianity and pro-African American. You know, the New Testament says that Christians are supposed to have a servant's heart, and the Marxists all want to portray the slave rebel and the runaways and such as that. But the reality is the slaves were good people. They were hardworking, sober, spiritual, law-abiding, safe, nonviolent, productive, congenial, fun-loving, good people. If a Southern physician was going to a patient late at night on a lonely Southern road and he approached a white person, the physician was concerned about his personal safety. But if black people approached, he was cheered up and glad to see them. It's a 100%, 180% difference between then and now in terms of the perception of African Americans, in terms of their danger. And of course, it's not racial. It's all boils down to discipline and society and what the laws say. I take a stand against victimhood and slave reparations. All the other writers are preaching victimhood and proven victimhood, and a good case can be made for victimhood. I'm not saying it's not true, but victimhood leads to discouragement, frustration, resentment, less effort, and anger. And slave reparations are so impractical as to not ever be in cash, certainly. So you can read all the reasons why slave reparations are simply not going to happen, not like people think. But there are no practical plans for slave reparations today. Everybody's still studying it. All right, what will the evidence in this book show? I rely heavily on the Federal Writers Project slave narratives, prepared from 1936 to 1938 by the federal government under FDR. They interviewed the slaves. They were old. It was during the Depression. And an amazing thing resulted that liberal scholars have been trying to suppress for decades. The slaves said good things about the Old South, about their former masters and mistresses, and about their life generally in the Old South, especially as to how much food they had. They had a lot more food in slavery than they had in Jim Crow or even the Depression. People don't like to give them any credit, but I do. I take them at their word, and I put their names in bold throughout the book. Over 400 will convince you that slavery is not as bad as, say, the Amazon Prime miniseries, The Underground Railroad, says it was today. That's fiction. We're dealing in facts. The slaves talk about music, dances, food, security, religion, hunting, fishing, quiltings, log rollings, and corn shuckings. The majority liked or loved their masters or mistresses. Now, some disliked and hated their masters and mistresses, and the ratio that I've determined is about 2.25 to 1 in favor of liking or loving their master or mistress. There were personal race relations back then, and the most amazing thing is that the slaves recognized the need for corporal punishment to avoid prison and to discourage stealing and not working, especially the women. And the women realized that after slavery was abolished, there was a lot more killing and getting drunk and cigarettes and goofing off than there was during slavery. Now, the slaves had to work hard, no question about it. Folks forget the early labor movement in this country because white people working in industry in the North had an average work week of 72 hours per week. We didn't get the 40-hour week until the Depression. So, slavery is not like a light bulb you turn on or off. Some form of slavery transmogrifies into other forms of subjugation. And it did for the slaves. As freed people, they were subject to Jim Crow, convict leasing, peonage, sharecropping, lynching, terror from the Klan, And, you know, in a way, slavery never disappears. It just transmogrifies into something else. And I deal with that. Now, of course, the slaves were immediately joyful when they heard about their emancipation. The young slaves tended to leave the plantation for a little while, at least. And the problem was there were no jobs for them. They were emancipated without land, property, or education. And there were no jobs. So naturally, they got in trouble. The white people started the Ku Klux Klan to keep them in line. And in the early years of the Klan, I've got about 8 former slaves quoted the effect that the Klan was needed at the time. Of course, it degenerated rapidly, and the planters lost their status, and the lower middle class took over. But and then it became a terrorist organization, pure and simple. I deal with the tragedy of emancipation in that up to 500,000 or 1 million African Americans lost their lives in the years immediately following emancipation. And I delineate the 3 holocausts of American slavery. The first one being the Ma'afa, the march to the African coast, where the Arab slave traders killed a lot of them because they couldn't keep up. The Middle Passage, but not slavery itself. Slavery itself was a time of prolific births and abundance. And then, after slavery was abolished, hard times came up because the highly efficient plantation economy was destroyed. And there simply wasn't as much food, clothing, shelter, and health care for everybody in the South. One of my nonfiction authorities is Time on the Cross, The Economics of American Negro Slavery, published in 1974 by PhDs, economists. They found that the slaves enjoyed good or adequate food, clothing, shelter, health care. They said that the slaves consumed 88% of their own economic production, and they said that the cruelty of slavery had been exaggerated. And one of these men won a Nobel Prize, so that was pretty believable. Now, in 1854, Dr. Nehemiah Adams, a Boston abolitionist, active in abolition activities, came to the South for his health, got off the boat in Savannah, Georgia, and was astounded that these slaves he thought would be cowed down and miserable were well-dressed, well-behaved, happy, and very good at music. And he predicted African Americans would enjoy success in music. And of course, that prediction came out to be true. African Americans largely invented rock and roll, jazz, blues, and several other musical genres. If you buy this ebook, you will enjoy over 230 photographs, paintings, etchings, maps, supporting the general themes of the book. And for $6.27 at Amazon Books, you can't go wrong just for the pictures and the photographs and the artwork alone. To establish credibility of my ideas, I use African Americans as my authorities. Those are the people I quote. Now, other than the former slaves, I quote Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass, W.B. Du Bois, multiple black abolitionists, including Solomon Northup, 5 modern black conservatives, Thomas Sowell, Shelby Steele, Walter Williams, Jason Riley, John McWhorter. And they make the case that the black family was not destroyed as a relic of slavery. No, it was destroyed by government policies that broke up their families. And they're pretty authoritative on that. Fiction surrounding slavery is well over 200 years old. From before Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it's been carried through in the Roots miniseries, Underground Railroad on Amazon Prime, and multiple other movies, books, and articles, and even some academic articles exaggerate the horrors of slavery. The horrors existed. The question is, how often do they occur compared to relatively better treatment, good treatment, and happiness on the part of the slaves? Happiness is not due to material goods. That's something that Marxists don't get either. Now, sexual exploitation makes people the angriest today, and I deal with that and show that it really wasn't usually rape, and it wasn't as prevalent as what everybody imagines today. It did happen, but got to put it in perspective. Now, I review critical race theory, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the 1619 Project. For the most part, I critique and criticize them, but I give them some credit, and I show that they have added some valuable things to the discussion. And everything is still in debate regarding slavery. Nothing is settled. Slavery happened. We can't change the past. We can only understand it accurately, truthfully. And I'm given the flip side of the victimhood story. And it's about time. In conclusion, African Americans worked their way up to the very top of the African diaspora. In terms of African descended people in the world, they are the most educated, wealthiest, most accomplished, and most famous African descended people in the entire world. And in proving that, I'm simply proving all over again what Booker T. Washington wrote in 1901. You've heard about all the victims of slavery. This ebook is about the winners, the people that overcame and became a great people. I hope you buy this ebook, and I hope you take a look at my other books, Prison and Slavery, A Surprising Comparison, A Case Against Critical Race Theory, and Get Tough and Smart, How to Start Winning the War on Drug Addiction. In each of those books, I learned something from the former slaves, and you can read about that. You will learn much from reading Truth About the Old South, A Case for African American Exceptionalism. I thank you very, very much.